Welcome to the latest in the advanced series of ADF Insider. My name is Grant Ronald and I'm a Senior Group Product Manager in Oracle's Application Development Tools division, and today we'll be looking at ADF binding internals. This is part one of a two-part series on binding, and today I'm going to focus on an introduction of the binding layer in ADF and the metadata that backs the binding layer. Specifically, we'll be looking at the data controls. What are data controls? What are their function? The binding layer itself. What is an attribute binding? A binding to a table of data or a list of data. And we'll give it a little peek into the various files involved in the binding layer. So just as a very quick refresher, the ADF architecture is based on something called Model View Controller. That means the implementation of the business service, the model layer, is separate from the user interface layer. And this presents a little bit of a challenge for us, and this is the goal of the binding layer, which is ADFM, the ADF model, which is part of a specification GSR 227. And the goal of this binding layer is to bind the different data services that you have to the various UI components that can consume those business services. So for example, your business service could be based on a database, access using JDBC, it could be web services, or it could be a plain old Java object. And you may well want to display that business service as a single attribute value, or it could be a collection being displayed in a table, or maybe some sort of list. So the challenge is, how can you bind these different UI components to very different data sources or business service sources? And the challenge is addressed with ADF model using something called ADF data controls. So a data control abstracts away the implementation specific details of the underlying business service. So regardless if your business service is based on a database or a web service or a plain old Java object, ADF data control exposes that business service in the exact same consistent way. And the second half to the solution is ADF bindings. So the bindings provide a particular way to bind your business service to a particular UI item, like a list, like a single attribute value. You might be binding to a method or a collection of data like a table. And the ADF control and the ADF binding work together to provide this very simple way of binding data services to your visual UI components. So let's take a closer look at data controls. So a data control abstracts the implementation details of the underlying business service by using a standard metadata interface. And this metadata interface, which is implemented in just some XML files, describes the underlying services, operations, and the data collections on that business service. At design time, visual tools such as JDeveloper can then leverage this standard service metadata to simplify the binding of UI components to the underlying business service, either the actions or the data collections on those business services. And at runtime, the generic Oracle ADF model layer reads this information, describing the data controls and the bindings, creates the right objects for it, and wires the binding and the data controls together so that your business service and your UI components are then linked together. And there are a number of benefits in this, that you're writing less code. The visual editors become simpler to use because you're using the same visual gestures for drag and drop and binding. And as a UI developer, you're protected from the underlying implementation details of that business service. Instead, you're always working with data collections and actions in the exact same way, regardless if that's using a web service, ADF business components, or a plain old Java object, or some other types of business service source. ADF 11G contains a number of built-in data controls. For example, if your business service is based on ADF business components, then that's already data control aware. You can also very quickly and easily, as I'm going to show in the demo in a minute, create data controls based on Java classes, web services, and other business service sources. And we mentioned ADF business components, and let's have a look. And here we can see the data control palette that you would have in JDeveloper, and you can see a data control which is representing or maps back to our application module. And within this data control we can see a number of data collections, for example departments view, employees view 3. Each of those are actually mapping back to view objects. And we can see a client method, so for example relocate employees is a method, and we have a number of built-in operations, create, insert. Now regardless of whether this business service is based on ADF business components, or if we were to build the same business service using a plain old Java object, the data control would still be represented in the same way. The data collections, the client methods, any built-in operations would be represented in the same way in this data controls palette. So let's have a look at creating data controls. Here we've got an application with 3 projects, one with business components business service, one with the Pojo business service, and one with our UI pages. Now as I mentioned earlier, ADF business components is data control aware already. That means the business server I've created here, and there you can see my application module. My application module has departments, employees, etc. If I go to the data controls panel and hit refresh, it will show and display the data control that abstracts the implementation of this application module. So if I look here, you can see my data control is called DC-emp-dept data control, which reflects my application module. And within this data control, you can see data collections, departments, employees within departments, and the operations that can happen on that data collection as well. So that's ADF business components. If I go to my second project, which is got Pojo implementation of emp-dept, and I'll go to my facade, and if I right click and create data control, JDeveloper will create the metadata interface that abstracts away that Pojo implementation of the data service. And in fact, if you look here, you can see session facade.xml is an XML description of that underlying Java implementation or Pojo implementation of the business service. And if I refresh my data control palette, I now see this new data control, of which the Pojo has a data collection of all departments, all employees, employees within departments, and operations that can happen on employees, exactly the same way as we have for this data control, which was based on ADF business components. And I have a consistent gesture if I want to create on this page departments. I drag and drop on as a form. Let's have some navigation buttons. And JDeveloper will now automatically create the bindings for that page of data to bind to that data control. And I have the exact same gesture if I want to go to my departments, which is implemented as a Pojo, and drag that on as a form as well. So as a UI developer, I'm building this page exactly the same way as I'm building this page. The data control palette is abstracting away the implementation details. The fact is that this is abstracting away a business service based on ADF business components, while this data control is abstracting away a business service which is based on a Pojo. So let's look at the ADF binding layer now. So in the demonstration I did a drag and drop from the data control palette onto a page, and JDeveloper automatically created the correct component for me. So what's actually happening behind the scenes? Well, when I drag from the data control palette, JDeveloper offers me an option which is, what type of UI component would you like to display this data as? And I could choose a form, I could choose a table, it could be a tree, or it could be a graph. Now, depending on what component I select, a different binding will be required. Now, why do we have a different binding? Well, because these UI components visualize or display data in different ways. So, for example, a table displays a collection or rows and columns of data, whereas a single text field only displays a single value. A tree control will show hierarchies of data, where a pie chart will show proportions of data against a whole. These different ways of displaying data require different bindings, so JDeveloper will prompt me, if required, for information about how that information should be displayed, that data collection should be displayed within the component. And JDeveloper will create the correct binding, and there are different bindings depending on those components, and reference that binding from the UI component. So automatically, JDeveloper will create the wires such that the UI component is wired up to the binding, and the binding is wired up to the data control, which references the business service. And this is all done automatically for you using drag and drop. So bindings abstract the details of accessing the data on your data collection or invoking any of the operations that are on your data collection. And there are essentially three types of declarative bindings that you'll be using here: iterator bindings, value bindings, and action bindings. So value binding simply binds a UI component like a text field or a table to an underlying data control value, and it might be a simple value, a single value, or it might be something more complex, where, for example, a table binding is binding to a complete collection of data, so many rows and many attributes of data. An action binding is used to invoke a custom or a built-in operation, so that might be a built-in operation like create, insert, delete, or it could be a custom operation such as hire employee, move department, fire employee. And the last option here, or the last binding here, is an iterator binding. And the iterator binding is a very important part of the binding layer, and that ensures that the current row as selected in, for example, a UI table, or the current record displayed in a form, is bound to the current row iterator of your business service. So ensuring that the UI current record indicator and the pointer to our iterator in the data source are both kept in sync as well. So where is information about these bindings stored? Well, for each page that you create, that's a data-bound page, you'll automatically get what's called a page def file. So the same name as the page, pagedef.xml, will be created, and this holds XML information, which is basically just the details of the bindings used by that page. Now, how can you access or view information about the bindings for a particular page? Well, you can do that in a number of ways. For example, you can right-click on the JSF page that you're editing and select Go to Page Definition, and that will show you the bindings for the page. Or along the bottom of the visual editor, there's a Bindings tab, and the Bindings tab, if you select that, will show you the bindings for that current page as well. If you want to change the location of the pagedef.xml, you can do this by going to the project properties for your view controller project and select ADF settings, and you select the package in which you store your pagedef.xml file. And you'll also notice in your view controller project a file called databindings.cpx. The databindings.cpx file references all the pages and all the page def files within that project. So it's actually holding a mapping between which page and which pagedef.xml file backs that page. So here's an example of the pagedef file for a particular emp-depth page. This time we're viewing in the structure panel, but there's various ways to view the same information. And you can see information, for example, the bindings and how those bindings relate to the actual physical UI components on the page. So for example, department name is bound to an attribute binding which is the department name from the data control. You have action bindings, so for example, first, previous, next and last refer to action bindings. You have a relocate employees, which is also an action or a method binding. We have a binding for the table of data, and that refers to employees view 3. And if you can detect that there are actually slightly different icons that are showing you the different types of bindings, for example, department ID, you can tell that's an attribute value binding. First, previous, next, last are action or method bindings. And if you look at the bottom in the structure panel, you'll see job ID, and job ID is actually a list binding, and that refers back to or is being bound to or used by a drop-down list of job ID. So within the page.def file, you can see the bindings that are used by that page or can be used by that page. As we touched on earlier, there are actually various types of bindings, and the reason there are different types of bindings because different UI components require data in slightly different ways. As I mentioned before, an attribute binding would typically be used if you want a single input text field to be bound to a string value. So for example, you might have employee ID, which has been displayed in a text field. You create an attribute binding. You may also use the same binding to display data, for example, as well as in a text field, but also in the title of a panel box or a tab as well. So a binding can be used in many places within the same page. You could have a tree binding, and a tree binding is used both for a table or a tree control, and that's used to define or binding to a collection of data, so many rows and many attributes of data. You can also have a list binding, and a list binding includes a list of legal values such that the user can select, and this would typically be used for some sort of combo box or drop-down list type of component, where as well as defining a value for the field, you also want to see a list of options. And you also have an action binding, and you would create and use an action binding if you want to call an underlying custom or built-in method on your data control, for example, next, delete, previous, create, or as we mentioned earlier, some custom methods like hire employee or close department. If you look at the bindings or the page def.xml for a particular page, you can see the bindings that are used on that page and the data controls to which they're bound. And in the middle is something called an executable. And an executable is simply acting as your current record indicator that ensures your binding is pointing to the correct record or row set or row within a row set in your data control, your business service. And there are actually different types of these executables, and the most times it will be an iterator, which is just iterating over a collection of data, but you can also have what's called a method iterator, which would iterate over a collection that was returned from a method. So what else do you need to know about bindings? Well, the first thing is that bindings don't have to be used in conjunction with UI components. In the previous examples, we've been talking about how when you drag and drop from the data controls palette and create a table, a binding is automatically created to bind to that table, for example. However, you can create a binding completely independently of a UI component. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, the example might be that you want to access a binding programmatically from a backing or a managed bean rather than having it bound to a UI component. Now, all of the binding information that's for a page that's held in the page def file is available through the expression builder or expression language, and if you look in the expression builder, you'll see a node, and under this bindings node are all of the bindings for that specific page, and that can be accessed using expression language hash, then the braces with bindings in between. And it doesn't always have to be the value of a binding that you're reading. It could be the value, which is, for example, the data value you're reading. Equally, it could be some sort of UI hint, or it could be something like range size on a data collection. So let's have another look at a demo of ADF bindings. So let's show an example of creating bindings. Here's the application we were building earlier with departments, and I'm going to add on the employees for that department as a read-only table. I can choose which attributes I want to display, row selection, and JDeveloper will actually create the correct binding for that component and hook it up. Now if I go to the bindings tab here, there you can see the bindings being created, a tree binding through an executable to this data control. And I can edit that binding if I wanted to add new columns or remove columns from the binding. Now I'll do the exact same on my Pojo page, and you'll see it's the exact same gesture. Here's the employees for departments, drag and drop on as a read-only table. I can pick and choose which attributes are displayed, and JDeveloper will create the binding. There you can see the binding through an iterator to this data control, which is my Pojo data control. And you'll notice that the bindings for the business components is going through a different iterator than this binding. Okay, because obviously each data source has its own current record indication. Okay, so let's go back to our business components page, and the next thing I'll do is, rather than get JDeveloper to create a binding for me automatically, I'm going to create a binding directly myself. Now the reason I want to do this is because this label here I would like to display the currently selected employee's name, and the way I'll do that is by creating a new binding. So create new attribute binding. This is going to be bound to my business components data control, the employees view, and the attribute, let's take the customer's last name. There's my binding, it's been created, and if I go to design view, I'll select the panel box and the text will be employee. And let's go to the expression builder. Here's my bindings object. Here's the binding I created, last name, and the attribute I want is input value. And I can do the exact same on the Pojo. I'll go to the bindings, create a new binding, and this time the data source is our session facade all departments employees. So that's the data control that is fronting our Pojo. And let's take a different attribute this time. Let's take the customer's email and OK that. And again, I'm going to hook up using expression language. There's email dot input value, and let's save and let's run that. Okay, there's our business components page. Let's navigate through some records. Master detail, and our currently selected employee's name is being reflected up here as well. Department 30. Let's switch to our Pojo page. Let's stretch it because our fields by default are right aligned. And there we're navigating through our Pojo data service. So Department 90, our business components, is keeping a different current record. And in both we've got the current employee's name. So one last thing we'll show now is, you may be aware that in ADF business components you have features such as UI control hints, where you can define labels or how the format a field, and also validation that can be done declaratively. Now that's a built-in feature of ADF business components. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have that sort of facility for other data services like Pojos and web services? Well, you can in a way. ADF Business Components provides another way of adding UI control hints and validation not on the business service itself, or you can do that in ADF business components, but you can also do it on the data control. And to show you that, if I go to the data control that was created for our POJO, so let's go to entities, and here is the XML that was created, and this is the XML that describes, or is the data control for the department's POJO. And if I double click here, it will bring up this tabbed editor, which will allow me to, for example, let's say department ID, let's say control hints will be dept ID, and for department name, let's have a label of dept name colon. And let's add a validator as well. In department ID, we'll add a validation, and let's have a list validator that the department ID must be one of, and let's just make a simple example, must be one of those values. This is not valid. Let's save. So what I've done now is I've added UI control hints and validation in a declarative manner to a POJO, and I've done it not directly on the Java class of the POJO, but I've done it on the data control, the XML definition of that business service. And I can go back and I'll run my page again. Let me show you everything's saved. Okay, let's go to our POJO page. And you'll see we've automatically picked up the control hints that have been defined not in the POJO but on the data control that fronts that POJO department name as well. And let's try our validation rule. Let's try 55 and navigate, and there we get our error message. So let's look at the files involved in binding. So as you're already aware, ADF Business Components itself is data control aware. That means there's no extra files created if you have or using ADF Business Components as a data control. However, if you have a POJO or a web service and you right click and create data control from those elements, then potentially two files are created, a data control description, which is a .dcx file, and structured definition, which are XML files. These are created in your model project. And it was these XML files that I was using to add validation and UI control hints. So that's the definition, or that's the description of the data control for non-ADF Business Components business services. When I drag and drop a data control onto a page, then a databindings.cpx file is created. And this file is the mapping between the pages you create and the binding files, which are the page definition files that back those pages. And these page def.xml files, usually one per page, are the definition of the bindings used by that page. And so this together gives you a binding context, which is your data control and your binding container. As I mentioned, the databindings.cpx file provides a mapping as to which pages, which JSF pages you have, and the binding files that back those pages. And if we look at an example of the databindings.cpx file, you'll see that we have a file called, or a page home.jspx, and that page is backed by a page definition file, homepage.def. So that is the file that has the bindings for the home.jspx file. And under page definition usages, we can see the actual path to that file, that page definition file. So to summarize, Data binding and data control layers are the engine behind drag and drop in Oracle ADF. So data controls provide a common abstraction over business services. Bindings take the information required from those data controls in a particular way required by, for example, a UI component, which might require a method binding. It might require a collection of data like a tree binding or a single attribute value binding. And this is all controlled through metadata or described through metadata. And at runtime, the page def file becomes your binding container. So that's the binding that you see in the expression builder, that you can link UI components to values from that binding context. If you'd like more information or see more in the ADF Insider series, then you can go to the Oracle page on the screen. Thank you very much for listening.